Hey guys, thanks for checking out this episode of the Helix Experience. Today I'm talking about bulletproofing your lower back, how, why, what, who. I'm going to give you a little bit of information on that. But first, if you get any piece of value from this episode, guys, make sure that you tell a friend, share it to your story, do what you need to do. Also, if you have a question for me to answer on this podcast, just go to our website, www.helixsp.com, click on media and podcast, and you can drop a question in the question box there. I'll add it to the questions and get it answered for you potentially in an episode coming up. So, lower back pain, let's be honest, it can be pretty debilitating. When I get lower back pain, it comes in the form of having a massive back pump. So my back gets so pumped that I basically can't do anything. My spinal erectors, or basically what attaches to my glutes and goes to my mid to upper back, gets so jacked up that I can't do anything besides stand up straight. And if I do bend over, I'll just kind of get shot back up with like this debilitating back pump. Usually it'll happen for me when I'm squatting big. So I'll squat big, lose my core tension, and then my lower back will have to take over. It'll cop the brunt of it. And then, my session will be over, so to speak. So that's kind of what happens to me. So, a lot of the times bulletproofing your lower back is also stabilizing and strengthening your core. One of the biggest issues, what this leads to, is degeneration in your lower back and a decrease in performance. So if you imagine every time you're doing a squat session or a deadlifting session, which obviously are the two biggest exercises that you can run and have the biggest bang for your buck and the best performance gain, if every time you're doing those exercises, you're not able to push at the percentage or the weight or the resistance or intensity that you'd like to, it's going to affect your overall performance. We all know training isn't about having one big session. It's about stringing many good sessions together for like 10 years, and then you'll be a weapon after those 10 years. So if you're like me and you want to reach your full potential, you know that having a lower back issue is just not an option. So what do you do? Well, anytime you have a weakness or an issue, it's really important to address those specifically and directly. Most of the time, we don't want to waste our, valuable time and training sessions just doing like stupid rehabby style exercises. But at some point, they are useful. So I've kind of developed a little bit of a guide on like how you would go about bulletproofing your lower back. Let's talk about like the mobility is the first one. So in terms of mobility in your lower back, the things, the directions that movement occurs in your lower back are forward rotation, hip rotation. Generally, like those are the main ones which I would go after in a mobility program. So if we're doing, mobility for the lower back on a forward range or forward position, I'll look at something like a forward bend and a hold, a Jefferson curl, a pancake stretch, legs spread coming out in front, holding that style of position to get some range or some length in that. Second, I was talking about like a hip rotation style exercises. A lot of the times when people have lower back issues, it can be from tight hips, not actually where it's at. So, a physio car, I can't remember who it was, like told me many, many years ago, it's not the area or the site that you get pain, it's the problem. It's usually above or below that area that is actually causing the problem. It's just manifesting in that specific area. So a lot of times lower back injuries or lower back tightness or weakness can be from other areas. So in terms of hip rotation, some of the best exercises I like for hip rotation are knee drops. I find they're really good. So imagine sitting on the floor, leaning back, hands on the floor, and then dropping your knees inwards for like 20 to 30 reps. It's a really good active stretch of the hips, which is incredible. And then other like hip rotational exercises would be in like a kneeling position, lifting your knee back and over in circles. You think about that's kind of like grinding out range of motion through the hips. A lot of the times in terms of mobility, it's like crusty. So it just feels like crusty. It feels like really kind of jammed up and gross. The best description of mobility I can think of is imagine you have like a tomato sauce bottle that's been sitting there for like a year and it's really like gluggy and thick and gross. And then all of a sudden you pick it up and you start shaking it up and it becomes more viscous and loosens up a little bit. The same thing goes with mobility. It's like every kind of day or week or month that you don't use that range of motion, it gets like a tomato sauce bottle. You just need to shake it up and grind out that range of motion again. Back pain or lower back pain or debilitation in that area gets worse and worse and worse over time. So, after mobility is more to just forward bends and rotations, hip rotations, that kind of thing. There are other mobility exercises, which, it's probably going to be too in-depth for this podcast. Next up, we've got activation. So the main areas of activation for improving or bulletproofing a lower back would be hip flexors, glutes, lower back specifically, and then any kind of stability or stabilizers in the hips. So if you think about the hip flexors, usually the hip flexors, like obviously as the name would state, their main role is to provide flexion on the hip. What happens if they're short and weak is it generally limits how one's performance in the lower back and how high one can raise their knee. So that's a good way to tell. You can test this with something called a Thomas test, which is a mobility test through the hips. But in terms of like an activation exercises for the hip flexors, we can do a band around the foot march. We can do a supine long band knee raise, which will also get the hip flexors nice and activated. Next up, we're talking glutes. In terms of glutes, we've got a couple of different variations of the glutes. So we've got maximus, minus, and minus. So medius and minus. Each of these is activated in different ways. So to activate the maximus, we want to do thrusts, and then the other two is hip external, internal rotations, and like lateral shuffles. So I'd think about doing some thrusts. I would think about doing some lateral shuffles, and I'd think about doing some abduction, adduction of the hips and knees specifically to get those activated. Next up, we're going to talk about some core work for bulletproofing your lower back. So the core has a couple of different actions. Mainly, we've got lateral flexion, extension, and bracing and rotation are the main ones, which I would think about here, which would be related to lower back health and bulletproofing it. So for lateral flexion and extension, I would think about doing like a side bend, side raise with a kettlebell. I'd be doing some side holds on a GHD. Bracing exercises, which are really good, would be like weighted holds of barbells on your back, heavy planks, heavy side planks, like that kind of stuff would be really good for bracing. In terms of doing some rotation or anti-rotation exercises, we can look at things like tennis swings and like a Pallof press there. So the last couple of things I've got here is throwing in some heavy carries. So carrying loads contralaterally. What contralaterally means is like in one hand. So we were going to load up one hand, do a farmer's walk. That's going to create the demand on our core for us to have to brace and activate the core. And then the last thing when bulletproofing your lower back is building a strength program that is short to long range of motion. So if I had an 8-week program, we want to be working on short ranges of motion on the main strength exercise to start to limit how much stuff could go wrong. So what I would mean by that would be doing like a rack pull from an above knee position. Next phase, we can go below the knee. Next phase, we can do a deadlift. And then in the final phase, we can do a snatch grip deadlift. So we're getting lower and lower and lower every time the range of motion is changing if we did that for 2 weeks each. In terms of like a program for something like this, I would suggest 2 times a week just to emphasize recovery. It's not how hard you can train, it's how hard you can recover. So all the work in the world doesn't matter if you can't get the recovery right. So on this podcast, I wanted to give you a little bit of information about what goes into a really good program in terms of bulletproofing your lower back. In summary, you need to have the mobility. We need to activate everything. We need to hit core exercises to get everything strong. We need to be doing off-center carries, and then we need our big strength exercises like deadlifts, good mornings, trap bar deadlifts, these types of things to build strength in there. The range of motion going from short to long. So actually, I did build a program for this, and it's called Bulletproof Your Lower Back. So if you want a copy of it, let me know. I can sort that out for you. Other than that, if you got any sort of value from this episode, don't forget to share it with someone. Hope you enjoyed it.